Some people will say, God told me to do this sort of a thing.
Mm.
And it's some horrific event, murdering their children. What makes Abraham so special? But makes his act an act of faith and theirs an act of murder. But I think as we unpack it, we'll see that there's a lot more going on. Abraham had already had a history with God. He had been talking and walking with God for decades. So this isn't something that just comes suddenly out of the blue, too much pepperoni on Abraham's pizza the night before, and so he has this wild dream. No, everything is at stake here. The promise of God is at stake. The future of this great nation is at stake. Abraham, are you going to trust me? Abraham tells his servants, we will go and worship, and we will return. There is this confidence that Abraham has that whatever is going on here, I can trust in the goodness of God.
There are some stories in the Old Testament that are extremely notorious and famously scandalous. One of those big ones is the story of Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain. And I think everyone knows the rest of the context of the story. I'm going to let you unpack it because I think this is a great example of one of those things that if you just read it on its face value without any context, you definitely can walk away from that story feeling a certain way about God, about why did he say to do that? How is this possibly moral? Like, what's going on here? And it can really rub you the wrong way.
Yeah.
And it has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So let's dig into that story and help the people listening understand that in a little bit more context and with more detail.
Sure. Yeah, sometimes I'll speak at a conference and there's a mother of young children saying, what do I tell my child when I'm reading through Genesis 22 and it says God is commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son? The child saying, Mommy, would you sacrifice me? Those are questions that parents are asking, and they're troubled by this. And I think it's a fair question, and we ought to unpack it. Some people will say, God told me to do this sort of a thing. And it's some horrific event, murdering their children. And this, they had a dream. And so they're God is telling them to do this. And so they do this, commit this heinous act. Why is that actually any different than, why is Abraham's act any different than what's going on here? What makes Abraham so special? But makes his act an act of faith and theirs an act of murder. But I think as we unpack it, we'll see that there's a lot more going on. Is what God is commanding Abraham to do with Isaac identical to someone who says, God told me to kill my child, and so this person ends up getting put in jail? What makes them so different? Well, I think it's important to understand that there are a number of things that are very different. For one thing, the morality of an act should also take circumstances into account. Just shooting a gun has no context. Are you aiming at a target at a shooting range? Are you defending yourself when you're shooting? Or are you breaking into someone's home and shooting someone and taking innocent human life? So there are contexts that you just don't just look at the act itself. You look at things like motivation. You look at the broader history of something. And you also recognize that there can be certain exceptions in unique circumstances. So let's begin to unpack what we're talking about with regard to Abraham. So did Abraham just have this voice coming to him out of the blue, had no understanding of where this voice is coming from, but it says, God is telling you this? Well, no. Abraham had already had a history with God. He had been talking and walking with God for decades. It's important to understand that there is a narrative context here. And what does that narrative context involve? It involves a promise to Abraham that this son Isaac is going to be the means of blessing to all the nations. So Abraham was told, through you and your offspring, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. So that son who's going to be offered up is going to be the means of blessing to all the nations.
You're saying that the significance of that is that he's not just putting, Isaac on the chopping block, if you will, but he's putting the promise itself. He's putting the whole history that he has with Abraham at the center of this crosshair in this same story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important to see. It's like, Abraham, are you willing to trust me? You've seen me do things in the past. You've seen me work miracles and prosper you and so forth. And so are you willing to trust me now that this isn't going to be the end of the story? Your sacrifice is not going to be the end of the story, but this is just an opportunity for you to trust me. So exactly right. And then God tells Abraham in very tender language, a number of commentators point this out, there's this kind of understanding, as it were, of God, knowing that this is a difficult thing that he's asking, but he says, please take your son, your only son whom you love, that is this child of promise, who is going to be the blessing to all the nations. Take him and offer him up as a sacrifice. So there is this command. Everything is at stake here. The promise of God is at stake. The future of this great nation is at stake. Abraham, are you going to trust me? So this isn't something that just comes suddenly out of the blue, too much pepperoni on Abraham's pizza the night before, so he has this wild dream. No, there is definitely something distinctive and theological going on here that relates to this promise being fulfilled, that God is not going to fail his promises. Will Abraham obey God? So the circumstances are far different than what we would talk about reading on the front page of a newspaper. And so there's that. Then Abraham actually goes out. Keep this in mind too. It's not as though there's this wee babe, Isaac. No, Isaac is carrying the wood for the sacrifice, so he could probably beat up Abraham if he needed to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So he's young, strapping young man who's actually going to voluntarily put himself on the altar. So there's something that Isaac is also getting in this narrative. But Abraham tells his servants, as they're looking at Moriah, which is related to the term, God is the God who sees and will provide for. The term provision is also related to that term. At Mount Moriah, where God will provide eventually that ram, that sacrifice in the place of Isaac. So Abraham tells his servants, he says, when they're 3 days out, he says, we will go and worship, and we will return. There is this confidence that Abraham has that whatever is going on here, I don't know all the details, kind of similar to a lot of people's questions about the Old Testament. I don't know all the details here. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I can trust in the goodness of God given what he has done in the past. And so Abraham is confident that whether Isaac dies and God is able to raise the dead, which is what Hebrews says, that Abraham believed that God was even able to raise the dead, or if there would be some other way, but he was confident that on the way back, Isaac would be accompanying him. And sure enough, that's what we see happening, that God does provide for Isaac, something in Isaac's place. So Abraham is speaking confidently, but yet to the very end, Abraham is faithful in carrying out the word of the Lord to him. So it reminds us that there is, again, this broader context. There's a narrative. A lot of people omit the narrative and just treat the act in and of itself and say, how is this any different from what you might see on a front page headline when somebody says, God told me to do this? So as we look at this text, we see that there is this confidence that Abraham has that this promised child is going to come through this okay. And just think, and it reminds us too that moral acts have a context to them, that if you don't understand a certain context, then you may misread what is going on in this particular act. And so just think about this. Somebody has given this example. If you have maybe 18-year-olds who, if say on their 18th birthday, you could kill them and they would come immediately back to life. I mean, on an 18th birthday, playing the game, let's kill the 18-year-old. And that, there's kind of, that person comes back from the dead just like that. Would that change the nature of killing an 18-year-old? Yeah, under ordinary circumstances, yeah, don't do that. That's bad. If that person comes immediately back to life, then there's no real grave concern here. The structure of things changes based on some of those circumstances that we would otherwise say, all things being equal, don't do that, but it's the 18th birthday, so there's no problem here. So likewise, when there's a promise of God, when there are the assurances of God, that changes the moral structure of things. And so we will reinterpret that act in a way that is different from just, like I said, that newspaper headline on the front page. There is something else going on here in that narrative with Abraham and Isaac.
It does, though, I think, raise an additional question for me, which is, what is the benefit of it? So let me unpack this a little bit. It reminds me a little bit of, why is that tree in the garden, though?
Mm-hmm.
Or why is God not more obvious in the world, though? It reveals something about the way that God operates with people, where he creates scenarios where you do have to trust him, or you're like, for example, in the Garden of Eden, don't eat that tree. But why is it there? But I'm telling you, don't eat it. There's something in that, right? Or with this Abraham story, it's similar. It's like God putting people through some type of a rite of passage or a trust test, or it's like a gauntlet, though, of some variety. When I read a story like this one of Abraham, it kind of feels like a cruel trick. Even if you know, like, you're holding the right answer behind your back. I think without highlighting, like, no, like, it's actually a blessing. It's actually an empowerment. It's actually for his good, and it's to, like, establish something in him.
Yeah.
I think without, like, featuring that, it still can feel like, haha, like, gotcha. I really had a plan the whole time. But I guess my question is it actually him transforming Abraham into the man that he needs to be somehow through this? Sure. What would be missing if this didn't happen?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think we can say a few things about, say, why is the tree placed in the garden? Why is God, we're told, putting Abraham to the test? Is this a mere cruel trick? We see that throughout the scriptures, God is testing people to see where their hearts are, to give them an opportunity to actually choose in his favor. And of course, they can choose the opposite. They can choose to go astray, as we see in the garden. But if there is no test, if there is no choice to make, then in a sense, God is perhaps rigging things. God is setting up this perfect environment, and there's no way in which they could even go off the rails. And so it's an opportunity to express, here you can freely choose to side with me, to align with me, or you can go in the opposite direction. There are certain crisis points in some of these patriarchal narratives where you have, for example, at Bethel, you have Jacob wrestling with God, where this is a moment where he is striving with God, and he prevails, that there is this night of wrestling, and this is a pivotal name. His name changes because he is putting his trust in God. He is one who struggles with God, one who wrestles with God and prevails and so forth. So you'll have these rites of passage, as it were, tests of faith that kind of mark and solidify the calling that God has on these patriarchs. You have this with Abraham, where this is a sign that the nation of Israel is going to come about because of the obedience of Abraham in response to the promises and provision of God. That in a sense, the nation's existence has come about because of the act of faith of Abraham. So he is seen as the father of faith, trusting in God. He trusts in God. In Genesis 15, Abraham believed the promises of God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And now he's actually acting in accordance with that promise and putting everything on the line, trusting in God. And so he is seen as the father of faith. And we read about this in the book of Romans 4, that he is the father of faith to Jew and Gentile. The book of Galatians also talking about that as well, that all who put their trust in God will find that they are children of Abraham by faith. And so Abraham is the pace setter, the model, the example of putting trust in God in extremis, in these extreme circumstances, that his trust is in God and that God is going to come through for him. And so the nation of Israel can look back on that act and say, Abraham obeyed, and we are flourishing as a people. We also see this as a precursor to what is going on in, say, Romans chapter 8, where God has told Abraham in Genesis 22, you have not withheld your son whom you love. Paul says that God did not withhold his son, but actually gave himself up for us. Isaac's life was spared, but he gave up his son. The Father gave up his son for us so that we might be those heirs of faith, children of Abraham. And so there is this continuity, this prefiguring that Isaac is a type of Christ, as Hebrews tells us, to be fulfilled in Jesus, who, again, is the sacrifice for the sake of the world, that God brings about a reconciling work through the act of God's sacrifice of his son, who, of course, Jesus himself lays down his life willingly. He says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord and take it up again in John chapter 10. So we see that this is a marvelous kind of theological unfolding. We see a precursor to this, kind of a foreshadowing of something that is to come later, that is even greater than the act of Abraham, God actually giving up his own son to bring about the redemption, that God has indeed provided a lamb. We see that Jesus comes to accomplish and bring to a climax, to bring to a fulfillment that which is been anticipated for so long. So there's this longing, this looking forward to, could this be the Messiah? Could he be the Messiah? And finally, the Messiah comes, as Galatians 4 says, in the fullness of time, when the time is ripe for the Messiah to come, when all of these things converge and come together in a powerful way, that he comes on the scene and fulfills all of those anticipations, those foreshadowings, Abraham and Isaac and so forth. And I think it's important for us to understand that he's living out Israel's story, that Israel failed, ancient Israel failed, but Jesus succeeded. We read about, out of Egypt I've called my son, referring to the Exodus in the book of Hosea. Then Jesus comes out of Egypt I've called my son, the true son, the obedient son, Jesus, that he goes through the waters of the Jordan, just like the Israelites went through the waters of the Red Sea, that Jesus goes for 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness and is tested and is successful, unlike Israel, who, they died in the wilderness because of their unbelief. Then we see the 12 apostles selected after that time of testing, just like the 12 tribes of Israel were apportioned in the land. So we see at every point Jesus is fulfilling the story of Israel. He's living it out as a faithful and obedient son to bring us into a new Exodus, to bring us into a new creation. And so Jesus is the true Israel, the true son, and also the true or second Adam, who fulfills what those precursors had failed to do and brings it to glorious fulfillment in his death and resurrection, and of course, ultimately in the new heavens and the new earth.
That's really good. And honestly, I feel like we could probably spend a whole video on almost like this topic, or even just on the garden and the original test, because I feel like there's so much to unpack there. And I know there's different views about the Garden of Eden and this and that, but at the very least, there's a sense in which, how can you have a relationship with someone with zero give and take or ask of any kind? The way that God wants to relate to us as his imagers is relationally. And there's something about a relationship that requires there to be legitimate options and choices. And in order for there to be trust, in order for there to be love, there has to be actually a choosing. You have to, and in order for there to be choosing, you have to have alternatives. So I don't know. There's a lot more that I feel like we could say about this.
And you're highlighting something very, very significant. That even and we could even talk about God giving the covenant to the Israelites and saying, "I have set before you life and death. Therefore, choose life that you may live." So that's what God desires. He desires for the Israelites to obey. He desires for them to have life. So God is even pleading with people, don't go that direction. This is going to bring harm to you. Rather, choose the path of life. If you repent, I will forgive you. You'll be reconciled to me. Don't choose the way of death. And so God is even expressing his longings, even his hurt. God is putting himself out there, as it were, that there in this relationship there is this challenge that it's a two-way street, that God is one who, of course, initiates the relationship, and then human beings can respond or say no. God desires to bless in a proper sense. That doesn't mean that there is no hardship or trial, but God desires for us to live life in abundance, and that comes through making those sorts of choices, those to enduring those tests, and to choosing life, choosing the way of God's kingdom, seeking first God's kingdom, and then He will take care of the rest.
And I feel like there's something in the context of this idea of choice and putting it to the test, and choose life or choose death, and choose this day whom you will serve. There's something where I feel like the gospel becomes more sweet and meaningful in this context when you see human failure again and again and again.
Absolutely.
And when I'm thinking of, is it Genesis 15 or 16 where the animals are split into two?
Yeah, Genesis 15, yeah.
Genesis 15, and that's the Abrahamic covenant, right?
Yeah.
So same character, Abraham.
Yeah,
So
you
like
got
you're saying, doesn't God come down in that pillar?
Yeah, no, this fire pot, that's
right.
This, at night as it gets dark, and there are these animals that have all been cut up, and this is what, the phrase "to cut a covenant," to make a covenant is actually literally cutting a covenant. That you cut up these animals, which Abraham did, cut them all in pieces, and what you do in a covenant is, at least some types of covenant in the ancient Near East, you walk through the pieces. Each party walks through the pieces, basically saying, may this be done to me as this animal or these animals if I violate my covenant with you. Abraham doesn't go through the pieces. It's God who goes through the pieces in this kind of this flashing fire, walking through the pieces while Abraham is watching. And God's saying, may it be done to me if I don't fulfill my promise to you, to Abraham, to make you a blessing to the nations, to multiply you as the stars of the heavens or the sands on the seashore. That is what God is doing. He's putting everything on the line. That the trust factor is supremely high here. God is laying everything on the line. He can't swear by anything higher than his own name, so he's saying, I'm going to do this, and it's not going to depend upon you, Abraham. I'm going to bring this about.
And in that story, I see such a foreshadowing of the gospel.
Absolutely.
Because it is in the same sense that God put on flesh, and He did the thing that we were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Abraham was supposed to be the one walking through there and upholding his end of the bargain, but then finally in the gospel, Jesus is like, I'm actually going to uphold your end of the bargain as well.
Right.
I wanted to ask you this question, and what you just said perfectly leads in here. So in Genesis chapter 22, verse 15, you have this quote. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore. So this angel of the Lord is saying that He will bless him. Is this a Christophany?
Yeah, so Christophany being some pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Well, some people will interpret it as such. It's a Christological reading of the Old Testament. And again, when you see the angel of the Lord and the Lord, they're interchangeable. There's a synonymity here that to hear from the angel of the Lord is to hear from the Lord. And so it wouldn't be surprising then to have this kind of a Christological understanding of what is going on in the Old Testament. And so, yes, because it is a triune act, the Father, Son, and Spirit are engaged in these acts of redemption. So we could certainly ascribe some sort of a Christophany here, some pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, the Son of God, in this sort of a scenario.
And in any case, like you said, it's all God, whether it's in the which part of the triune God are we talking about. But to me, there's something beautiful if that does end up being the case, and we find that out in about 10,000 years. If that is the case, to me, there's something beautiful about that, because here is the one coming who will actually be sacrificed.
Yeah.
And for him to look at Isaac and to say, no, you don't actually have to do it. But I will.
Yeah.
To me, there's something about the son looking into the face of the son and saying, the Old Testament equivalent of "I got you, bro."
Yeah.
is really awesome. So I don't know if that is or not, but I just think that's that ends the story on a very beautiful poetic note, which I think highlights the point that you're making. That basically here's God showing that He's good. Here's God showing that there is a support system and a plan in place, and there was the entire time. There was never a scenario when you were actually going to have to do something that would go against the commandments that I've given you. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
I like that idea, which is not a good reason to adopt a theology, but I like this idea of the son looking at the son and saying, you don't have to take the blows, I will.
Yeah. No, I think you've presented it very well. I think with theological accuracy. It is a powerful moment here where we see this. Isaac is clearly described as a type of the one who is to come. So yes, this would certainly fit that very picture, and say that yes, Abraham, you don't have to give up your son. In the end, I will lay down my life for all. I think it's a perfect way to wrap up the conversation.